this with us. Thank you for everybody for your interest in joining. The International Humanistic Management Association is a group that is trying to promote better organizing. And we leave it at that high level because we think that we need to organize better to just ensure survival at this point, but also potentially with the ambition to ensure a world in which we can all thrive. And I think the talk that Otto is going to share with us today is very much in line with that, with leading towards well-being. How can we sort of shift the various mindsets that are underlying our current practices, daily practices, but also managerial practices, organizational practices, societal practices that we might need to adjust in different ways. At IHMA, we call it two principles: for the protection of dignity and the promotion of well-being, that signify this potential shift, transformation towards better organizing. And we're trying to reach out to a number of audiences, including academic audiences, practitioner audience, and the policy audience. So anybody that's interested, please check us out. This is one format that we're doing. We're doing a couple of others. So thank you, everybody, for being here with us.
Yeah, the senior lecturer at MIT and founding chair of the Presencing Institute. He chairs the MIT Ideas Program for cross-sector innovation that helps leaders from business, government, civil society to innovate at the level of the whole system. Otto has written several books, many of them best-selling: Theory U and Presence, as well as Leading from the Emerging Future, and most recently, The Essentials of Theory U. He's co-founded the MIT XU Lab, and I hope I'm saying that properly, but Otto can correct me if not. Has received many awards, prizes, distinctions, and again, we're so pleased to have you join us today.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to this series here. I'm really happy to be part of this group because I wanted to connect it to the network and association for a while, and I'm happy to make a start this way. And I think, Erica, you sent out like an article, which is so a little blog entry from last week, which is maybe one background for our discussion. And I will make a few more remarks. Maybe that can just throw out a few more pointers for jump-off points for our discussion.
Great.
And what interests me, and I think that's probably a connection point among many of us, is that I have been always interested in how is it possible that we can turn the classroom into a place where students participate in not only making the world a better place and making themselves a better place, but also in the practical methods and skills for local global movement building and building kind of the capacity and the connections that it really requires to have an impact in the world. So that's, and I will, share a few experiences outside and also inside the classroom that maybe can kickstart our conversation. This here is, of course, something you have seen many times, the iceberg model. And what drew me here to MIT is really the systems thinking approach. And which starts with the distinction between symptoms and root issues. And then you see the evolution of systems thinking by kind of differentiating what is below the waterline from structures to mental models or thoughts, kind of to deeper sources. And instead of deeper sources, we could also say awareness or consciousness. So what I will be presenting, I would refer to as awareness-based systems change. And one way of summarizing that would be with the following 3 sentences. You cannot understand a system unless you change it. Of course, kind of that was the reason why I came here from Europe, basically, to learn how to do that some 2 decades ago. Then number 2, the one sentence summary you could say from Theory U, which is you cannot change the system unless you transform consciousness. And then number 3, the big question, of course, how do you really do that? The transformation of consciousness. So if that matters, how do you really do that? You cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. So I would say that systems thinking, the essence of systems thinking-based interventions in real-world change always has been making a system see itself. But from a Theory U perspective, we would kind of qualify that even a little more, and we would say, unless you make a system sense and see itself. So it's not good enough to just make the system see itself, because then we are just stuck in the head and suffering the knowing-doing gap. So to really unblock that, we need to connect to the heart, and we need to connect to the heart of the collective. And how to really develop methods and tools for that has been the central avenue of my own inquiry. What are the symptoms? So what, one way of how I like to, differentiate them is along these 3 divides: ecological divide, social divide, spiritual divide, which, of course, if you want, you could map along the 17 SDGs as it is suggested here by our colleagues from Indonesia recently. What's the problem today? The challenge, it's basically, we live in a world of disruption, and that's kind of the number 1 challenge in this century, probably individually, as teams, as organizations, as societies. What does disruption mean? It means like the future here on the right-hand side is going to be different from the past, which then, and presencing or Theory U takes a perspective. So how do we move from here to there? How do we move from the current to the emerging future? And the perspective that presencing would take on that question is that it's not only an outer journey that takes us, for example, to the edges of the system, but it's also an inner journey that requires us to connect with the deeper sources of knowing. So disruption happens, we know that, but what are the responses we see in society? We see 3 responses, right? The first one is downloading, same old, basically an extension of the status quo. The second one is much more radical. It's turning backwards, kind of reorienting, turning back to the past, basically, in order to make ... great again. And the third one is kind of leaning forward, leaning into what is wanting to emerge. So we know this operating system well: ignorance, hate, fear, AKA it's a freeze reaction, freezing or closing the mind, the heart, the will. Or when we begin to lean into the future, kind of to opening the mind, the heart, the will. So what are the 5 behaviors that we see worldwide playing out? Kind of, you could call it Trumpism or some other ways, but it's basically blinding, which is not seeing; desensing, which is not sensing; absensing, so which is losing the connection to your highest possible future; blaming others; and destruction or self-destruction. I don't need to go through all these numbers, of course. We have seen that often enough. But what I would like to say is that, in my view, kind of this phenomenon, the upper phenomenon, Trumpism, is the result of 2 factors. One is disruption, and the other one is a lack of a capacity to connect with these 3 things on the lower half here: the open mind, the open heart, the open will. Why do we have in society institutions of education? To develop these things, to develop the capacity when disruption happens to access the open mind, access the open heart, access curiosity compassion and courage. And if we have not developed that, when disruption happens, it's throwing us into this upper space, whether we intentionally want that or not. So that would be, you know, you could see Trumpism as a massive educational failure. So the 3 words today for our current condition: post-truth, post-democracy. The post-truth is, you know, stuck in our filter bubbles, echo chambers. Post-democracy, our society is being ripped apart, as we know. And the post-human, that would be a whole other talk. But we don't have the time for that now. So where do we see the seeds of the future now? In creating infrastructures on a societal level on 3 different levels: learning infrastructures, democratic infrastructures, and new economic infrastructures. So basically whole systems learning, right? Whole person, whole systems learning, integrating head, heart, and hand. New democratic infrastructures, making them more democracy, more direct, distributed, more dialogic. Conversations that make us, that make the system see itself. And then new economic infrastructures, particularly kind of around collaboration and applying systems thinking on an industry or on a whole system level. So what are examples? If we just kind of double click now on the new economic infrastructures, kind of that's kind of the topic, ego to eco. What does that really mean? I think it means 2 things for us, you know, and also working with younger people. It's really 2 main capacities. The first one is understanding the bigger system. And of course, more than half of all our problems come from outdated economic theories, right? So we need to rethink the essence of economic theory based on the externalities that we face today. So the 7 acupuncture points where we see capitalism as we know it transform as we speak are conversations that are already going on, and most of you are probably very well familiar with. So I'm just going here on a headline level, nothing in detail. From linear to a circular economy, that's the whole nature piece. As I go through this, I'm really going through an economic production function, right? Nature is first. Then labor, of course, from jobs to entrepreneurship. UBI kind of as one of the key concepts here. Capital, kind of from extractive to intentional capital. That would be a whole other talk. Technology, kind of from addictive to more enabling or co-creative technologies. Management, from hierarchical to more ecosystem leadership. Consumption, from GDP to G&H or well-being, and then coordination governance, from hierarchy and competition to awareness-based collective action, which means really applying systems thinking on an ecosystem level. So the macro piece, kind of rethinking economic theory or the key categories of economic thought from a you know, from an ecosystem awareness, kind of shifting these categories that are in traditional economic theory framed from an ecosystem awareness, reframing them from an ecosystem awareness. I think that's job number 1. And job number 2 is a social technology, because what we really need is, and in all practical work, what we need to do is basically the same thing, which is that in my experience, regardless whether you work with governments, companies, NGOs, it's all the same. The key leadership challenges that leadership teams face cannot be solved by any single organization or sector alone. To address these issues requires us to develop approaches that bring in together stakeholders that jointly go through a journey where they shift their silo perspective more to a systems view, or to use a different word, where they shift their ecosystem awareness more to an ecosystem view. So I'm an action researcher. here at MIT, and I have explored that question over the past 20 years, mostly with practical experiments. And, you know, occasionally writing an article or a book, but, you know, most of my time gets burned through practical experimentation. And what I learned through these practical experiments is basically three things. So what does it take to, you know, to shift the mindset, or to kind of to address, to innovate in the face of disruption, you could say? Well, the first thing what it takes is a process, right? So you can't just bring people together. You need, it takes a journey, a process that moves people out of this, what you see on the top left, downloading old patterns, and into the observe, really connecting to the system from the edges, connecting to the deeper sources of knowing. And then the learning by doing, the prototyping, kind of applying design thinking and other related principles. So you need a process that is going through these three stages one way or another. That's the first learning. And the second one is you need some inner leadership work that essentially is cultivating these three capacities: open mind, open heart, open will. And what I mean with open mind is the capacity to suspend old habits of thought. In other words, to see with fresh eyes. What I mean with open heart is to look at a problem through the eyes of your stakeholders. So through the eyes of another, not just from your own perspective. And what I mean with open will is letting go and letting come. So, and the third learning is that, why is this so difficult? Because when, in my experience, kind of when you put yourself on this journey, kind of from your old patterns towards kind of connecting to your deeper sources of knowing, it is often difficult to progress, particularly if you do it in a social context, because we are confronted, the moment you take the first step on that journey, we are confronted with three enemies, or as I would say, as a you know, European, kind of three inner sources of resistance, which is voice of judgment, voice of cynicism, and voice of fear, which are basically blocking the opening of the mind, of the heart, of the will. From a mindset that looks at reality like this, which is, you could say, more like an ego perspective, seeing reality out there, to this, which is seeing the system in a way that includes yourself, seeing yourself through the eyes of another. And when we go through this shift from here to here on the level of the individual, that's what we call awareness or mindfulness. And when we do that on the level of a group in communication, from here to here, we call that a shift from debate to dialogue. So dialogue is not people talking to each other. Dialogue is really making a system see itself. Where does that, and that's, as I said before, that was kind of my third principle. That's really where, when I work with practical systems, where the added value comes in. That's where the consciousness of a group is shifting. When you make a system sense and see itself. What are practical methods of doing that? So this is kind of one thing you see, it's called like 3D mapping. You map the current system, and then you look at it through a structured process of questions, and you get all the different voices out, and then you change it towards the emerging future. Here, this was kind of the all the business unit leaders from the Alibaba group. So like a bunch of different companies that work as an ecosystem, 30, 40 people in the room. So we have like just a different bunch of tables. This is in Brazil, 150 people in the room. So we have more tables, and then make people share across tables. So you begin to see the shared patterns across tables. This is a different method that's, that we developed at the Presencing Institute, which may be really the most important contribution we have made for the social change, which is called social presencing theater, because it's very effective in mapping multi-stakeholder meetings and then making a system sense it, see itself, and making visible structural violence kind of, and the less visible dimension of systems change and the blockages, and making that visible to the entire system. So it's like blending. Probably some of you know the constellation work. So it uses elements of that, elements of social science theater, and elements of mindfulness and embodied knowing. So this guy here is a banker from Indonesia. They are mapping one of the biggest multi-stakeholder processes, but the role he plays is Mother Earth, right? So the three divides are always represented in these gatherings by bringing in the voice of nature, the voice of the future, and the voice of the excluded groups. This is using the same method at Lakeside University, founded by Jack Ma, kind of with entrepreneur owners, owner CEOs of Chinese companies a few weeks ago. So you can use these methodologies, so where each company was represented with their top 3 people, and then they make each participate in each other's cases, kind of do multi-stakeholder mapping there. And Financial, the biggest fintech company in the world, who, by the way, succeeded in making 220 million Chinese customers participate in reforestation activities through Forrest, the app. So how, in this case, this is kind of the third method here, which is simply learning journeys, sensing journeys. So the team, the top 30 people of the company spent like a week basically in a very detailed way, understanding and feeling and interviewing the entire business ecosystem that they have in 2 different countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines and Indonesia. And then they came together, so 3 days for that, and then 2 days synthesizing that in Singapore. And so it is embodied knowing. So they felt what all the stakeholders of the business ecosystem in these countries feel like, and understood their perspectives. And then from that sensing activity, they moved into having a very different conversation with each other about where they wanted to take their globalization strategy. So last point here is how does systems thinking really apply to the evolution of systems? And what I would see is basically the same structure of evolution of systems change across all major systems that I have been working with. And it's moving through the following 3 stages, kind of from input and authority-centric, so like in healthcare and learning, traditional teacher or doctor-centric systems. That's the past. Present is this, output and efficiency-centric, so evidence-based medicine or teaching for testing, right? AKA bulimia learning, fast in, fast out, which of course is the opposite of real learning, which gets us to the good hospital and the good school, right? Learner-centric and patient-centric. Is that the future? I don't think so. I think the future is yet something different. In health, it is not patient-centric medicine, but it is strengthening the sources of well-being and health. So moving away from reacting to the health issue symptoms to really strengthening the deeper sources. And in learning, of course, it is kind of activating a more whole person, whole systems approach to learning, integrating head, heart, and hand. Farm and food, same thing, traditional farmer-centric, industrial agriculture, the mother of half of all our ecological problems. Organic agriculture, that's a step forward. It's reducing negative footprint. Yet it's not the future, because in the future, it's really about increasing the positive footprint in terms of healing planet and people. Finance, you can do the same thing, traditional, Wall Street, impact investing, right? Which is nice, but not really addressing the deeper systems issues, which would be yet something else. And the evolution of corporate responsibility, same thing. Alleviating projects, corporate practices, business innovation. Now, say I have a electric car and all these nice things, but does that address the real root issues of sustainable mobility? Not at all. So it's that's yet kind of something different that needs to be developed. How does that relate to the classroom? So the traditional approach was, well, transformative learning experiences you can only do in small groups. And that's also what I thought. And then 3 years ago here at MIT, I got the possibility to move my class, which is called ULab here at Sloan, to this platform, which resulted in a user group of now 120,000 participants. Not all of them, of course, are active, so don't get the wrong impression. But it is like they have formed communities in places around the world, kind of significantly. We have more than 1,200 on our website, but many hundreds that are still active. So it really activated a global innovation ecosystem, right, of communities that have a life way beyond the end of the course. And so that really, this phenomenon, kind of activating this kind of ecosystem that was already dormant there before, really brought up this idea of that I, suggested at the end of the paper that was sent around, the little blog, of the Society Transformation Lab, which is really the idea to create like a prototyping infrastructure. So it's a part two from ULab. ULab is really for individuals connecting to your deeper source of knowing. The Society Transformation Lab is really for teams moving your idea into action and real world impact. And we are now addressing some of the key challenges, and we are now talking with a whole bunch of partners, including the UN, Teach for All, Ashoka, and so on and so forth, to really bring together a broad coalition of organizations and networks that work together around this key issue, basically implementing the Sustainable Development Goals at scale and then creating a parallel track at universities, kind of that help students to participate, to connect to these initiatives, and to participate and learn how to engage with the new methods and tools of movement building, which are in part digital and in part related to really offline social technologies like deep listening, kind of in circle work, where we can activate the more deeper human dimension that is required in change. So that's basically, that's like a big picture flyover here. So let me stop this and move from here into the conversation. Sorry, it was probably a little bit much, but that's a little bit, I guess, coming back to my original question, how to turn the classroom into a place that allows students to participate and shape global movement building. That's where I think we have a real opportunity today with the new social technologies and the way we can connect with each other, that I would love to explore, and where this kind of societal transformation lab is just one of the avenues that could be used to make that more practical. Maybe I have a point of view, and that is to go fast and to speed up, you need to slow down first. There's no other way. So all this talk about speeding up, I think it's just adding to the noise. And if you want to build a movement, you need to go deep in a small place first. I mean, that's what we have been doing for many years. So, so people think that you put something like ULab online, it has a big resonance, and they think it's about the digital stuff. It's not true. It's about all the offline stuff you have done before. It's about these deep, small networks. I think most people misunderstand what the power of digital is, because when you only think it about in terms of digital, the key really is linking the online with the offline. So the key to movement building and to speed and to massive impact is offline stuff, kind of having circle work, having personal practices, kind of having small circle work, having really deep listening practices, and be really rigorous about that. Also giving people permission to really focus on that and tune out from the noise, basically. That's what practices, whether it's individual or face-to-face, is. That's my point of view, and that's where we try to contribute.
There's another question in terms of the scale. And in some way, the example of the Italian MS5, is it MS5? Is it the Cinque Stelle? And that they're sort of adopting, according to the question, some of these ideas that you're presenting. And the question is more like, how can these ideas be implemented at scale without falling into the populism trap that the questioner is seeing?
Yeah, that's so I'm not exactly aware of what in Italy the questioner is referring to, but that's a good question, and that's why I have in this paper that was sent around, there's really the distinction between 20th century political discourse, left and right, and it's an issue between ideologies, and 21st century political discourse, which is discourse between open and closed, and it's kind of a distinction, you know, off level of consciousness, right? So it's really like an axial shift, and I would say the answer to the issue that you articulated, Michael, is that we needed. So it's really kind of the opening of the mind, the heart, the will. That means you know, really to reaching out to the other ecosystems rather than closing down and creating architectures of separations and us versus them. Now, sometimes it can be so that's it. I believe in any of these issues there. So if you deal with the complex systems of our time and with the reality of really interdependence, it means that if you address these any of these issues more on a root issue, you need to connect to many other players, and that only can be done effectively if you go through this opening process. And that's where I think the leverage point is the capacity of doing it. It's not on the level of ideology that we would not be agreeing doing it. It's a question of capacity, and that's why I think our community here has such a critical role in that story.
There's a question about appreciative inquiry as an approach in contrast to or in relationship to this systems approach. And that's also tied to the question of whether you're seeing more receptivity to this in other cultures other than perhaps American culture or Western culture. It looks like there's quite a bit of traction with Asian companies that you've worked with. Can you comment both on the appreciative inquiry distinction and also where you feel like this has had the most traction?
Yeah, so I would say, so there is a whole group of methodologies, and I would all refer to them all, including, of course, AI, as awareness-based social technologies, right? So they are all kind of based on the same fundamental assumptions, sort of the ones that I suggested. You could, you know, frame them a little bit different, but you know, it's kind of a similar set of assumptions. and they all belong. That's why I use this awareness-based social technologies or kind of awareness-based systems change, because it is intentionally not called like you process there. It's not like that specific methodology, but it's more like an umbrella term that would be inclusive of many other methodologies that share the same basic principles. And the way then, for example, the U process is being used is as a meta framework, because it allows you to bring in AI, for example, is particularly useful when you go down on the left-hand side of the U. There's kind of many great methods and tools you can use there. Maybe on the right-hand side of the U, a little less developed, right? That's where you want to strengthen that with some other approaches. And so it allows you to kind of combine the best of these methodologies. And like you, I mean, I'm like, with one part of my life, I'm like maybe a framework builder, a social technologist, kind of who is, developing social technologies, awareness-based social technologies. But, with much of my life, I'm also just a user, right? So I am working in the classroom and client situations and systems interventions. And as a user, we all have the same problem. We need to combine all these different methodologies and bring them together in a way that is that makes sense. So in that regard, that's a very familiar situation. And I think in the field, many practitioners already integrate all these tools in the way indicated. Then what was the other question?
Just the traction as far as cultures.
Yeah. So traction, yeah. So for example, when I present that in China, I would emphasize a little more. I get like, so when I present that in China, a reaction I often get is, what? Who are you? So you're like American, a German American coming here telling us this. This is our stuff. This is not your stuff. This is not Western side. This is our stuff, right? So what you are talking about. So there's like, so that's a reaction I often get, right? And that has led me to say, yeah. So to say, yeah, you already know, right? So, maybe through cultural revolution and other disruptions, kind of, so I basically, I'm going there as a Westerner and giving them permission to reconnect with their own best sources of their traditional culture. And of course, over the years, you learn to bring in some of these elements a little more, right? Kind of, how does the essence of Buddhism, of Confucianism, of Taoism really relate to that? And so I would bring that out a little more, right? Kind of in the later stages of a process, when you more come to the bottom of the U, more to the spiritual dimension. And like in Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country on earth, then they say, well, this is kind of the essence of, of our religion. So that kind of the open mind, open heart, open will, and and then they exemplify that in different versions, even though that may not be the orthodoxy, right? Kind of that is maybe more dominant, but at least in Indonesia, kind of, I have got similar reactions there. I would say, so for Asian, in India, I have just personally less experience, but just from individual encounters, I'm going less regularly there. But of course, I mean, India sees itself as the mother of all religions anyhow. So everything comes from there at the end. So yeah, so there is also deep connections there. With particularly on the realm of the distinction between small s self, capital S self, right? Small s self, my current ego, and capital S self, my highest future possibility. So I wouldn't spell that out usually, but I mean, everyone, who knows a little bit of kind of the context, knows that this has been a major theme, kind of, also in the Hindu and the Indian kind of spiritual tradition. So, yeah. So when you say Western religions and Eastern religions or wisdom traditions, clearly there is, you know, on the Eastern side, there are many connections. But I always, so for me, it's never about religion, or I don't even emphasize that, since mostly, like the rest of us, we work with diverse groups of people. So my goal is actually to giving a terminology and methods and tools that allows people to pay attention to the deeper level of their experience, right? Kind of particularly on the third and fourth level of the U. So the more subtle aspects of our experience, and to not buy into religious dogma, but, you know, really being more precise and connecting with your own experience, which is really what science is about, right? So I'm more kind of interested at that interface, letting the data talk to you, let your experience talk to you, and become more a black belt in how we observe, how we listen, how we connect, how we, you know, when we engage with a situation, really connect not only on the level of the mind, but also on the other levels of knowing. That's really what is practical value, because when you deal with disruption, that's the kind of knowing that really is then more relevant for you. So coming back to your question, so where does it resonate most? The user, if you just go by numbers, so we have like 3 clear biggest user numbers, which is North America is one, Europe, the other one, and then China, East Asia. That's the third one. Those are the 3 main clusters.
Could you share with us some examples of what changed after you make these interventions, and how the groups that you've intervened with sort of maintain this new sense of awareness that they've gained during these experiences? Thanks.
Okay, so to both parts. Well, to some degree, I mean, often we don't really know. And we have seen like a whole spectrum. So if you, the reality is, if you move to MOOC-based structures, massive open courses or learning infrastructures, the first thing you need to get used to is kind of, you totally give up any kind of control. People do whatever they want with your stuff. And so it's really all over the place. And I'm not saying it's all great, right? So it's all over the place. And we have, from those who participated in the U-Lab, the first years, kind of, we did assessments there, and it was usually like 30 to 33% who talked about life-changing. So, I mean, something experiences, and then, you know, like another group of that size, kind of with eye-opening. So for a number of people, something significant happened. And if you double click on that and say, where did that happen and why? There's usually, most of that, I would say, is related to either small circle work. So we really give them kind of quality processes for small circle work, where they really build the container, because nobody shifts consciousness by watching any video nonsense, right? So by you know, being just an observer, you need to be in a deep listening space in order to really go through a deeper transformative process. And we basically, you could think about it as a radical decentralization of the classroom, right? What the MOOC is, if it really works. You hand over all your tools and you make them create these holding spaces for each other. And that's like in these circle work, but also in hubs, kind of where they come together in place-based communities. So that's one thing that we learned. And there, but then there are others, like many people kind of, they start something and then they can't continue. So there was just a connection, it's incomplete. As I said, it's really all over. In principle, so when we looked at that, so I'm coming I'm coming from that, and I'm also asking myself, so what is my role in this here? So there's already like enough personal change in the world. I don't need to contribute to that. So it's like well covered. There's enough systems change in the world that doesn't get gets enough traction. I think where I try to come in is really where that blends, right? Kind of the personal and the consciousness perspective kind of to the system. And that's why when we then looked at what comes out of ULab, there's often, sometimes the aspirations go full through and there's really, amazing impact that you see even years after, right? So that's also interesting. These groups keep meeting and, prototyping initiatives take off long after the end of the class. So there's something kind of really long-term working there. But often, if I look at it more from a critical perspective, I would say it stays also often in the personal space and is not always really transforming the system, right? So, and that's really the starting point where we thought by listening to these experiences, then people have all these aspirations, but they are not materialized. ULab is over and now what? So that's where why we developed the Societal Transformation Lab, to really focus more on teams and on the system's impact. So it's like a companion, it's a part 2 of this process, just to nudge people more to the systems change, because that's what we try to be in service of. We don't want to be just another infrastructure that is primarily and only working on the personal and person-to-person space. So that's one answer. But maybe the other one, Sandra, that I want to, it's like an insight we really had in running these experiments. So where does the change happen? It's personal. It's kind of the circle work, the hubs, the place-based groups. And the other piece that they always reported on is we have these live sessions where people come together. So we broadcast that here from next door. So from out of MIT, it's a 1-hour broadcast, and we invite people in to join that as a global community in the same hour. And interestingly, even though the technology we use, everything we use is not really the way you want it in terms of interactivity, there is something happening there because we use mindfulness practices as part of the group. We really, so again, my third principle, make the system sense and see itself. We design these global sessions to do that, to make the community sense and see itself. And one aspect of that is using, a global mindfulness moment that connects your attention to your own body and then to the larger community that you are part of, to the planet and stuff like that. So it's just a few minutes, but we heard that kind of, so people say, I realized that I'm not just the odd person in my own community. I am part of a larger movement, and that allows me to wake up to my real aspirations, and also to have more courage to activate my local stakeholders and my local ecosystem of change makers around that. So it's like an interesting thing that the global community becomes a container that helps me to connect with my more personal, deeper intention and actually make it happen in my own context. So that's a real interesting discovery, because when you say, well, who's the teacher there? It's not the guy who's talking from MIT. It's not necessarily another person in my local context, but it's the global community. So it's kind of the global field of connections that people feel, and that gives them the confidence to connect more deeply with their deeper aspirations. And I think that because that is so much missing today, I just think it's interesting, because I think it's a space where we could do a lot more as a global community of educators.
But there was just a question about peace, and how does Theory U relate to the broader concept of peace? Can you comment on that?
That's a great question, particularly because I hardly ever get that. So I first need to write down the question, because that's more interesting than the answer. So peace is more than the absence of war, right? So there's so positive peace is more than the absence of war. And what it really is, I believe, is the so my thesis advisor was the peace researcher Johan Galtung. So the guy who invented the theory of structural violence. What is structural violence? You have victims, but not direct. It's not a person. The perpetrator is not a person, but it's an economic structure, for example. So I think positive peace is essentially about reducing structural violence, transforming economic structures, and to some degree even maybe advancing also political or democratic structures in a way that generates more well-being for all, kind of, which is basically the topic of a network or of our community. And so if you think about positive peace, it has everything to do what we try to make happen in this community. When you look at the absence of peace today, it is, in part through direct violence, of course, that needs to be addressed. And there is, I mean, this whole, another area that I find very interesting, but know very little about, is that trauma, right? So, but I know that there is a number of people who use theory-related concepts around trauma, because trauma is basically a freeze reaction towards something, towards an injury. And then the healing is basically creating a container, right? So it's, when you think about it in terms of the U process, it's all about, so when you deal with historical trauma, when you deal with structural violence, I remember, so as a German being in Namibia, to, near the first workshop was one of the sites where the first Holocaust in the 20th century was committed. So when you go through these, when you deal with these historical traumas and deal with groups kind of where these things have happened or are present, then the key is to create the container, right? To create a healing container in a really skillful way. So in other words, it's not speeding up the process, but you need to slow down the process so that kind of some of that can come back to the surface and can be reintegrated in the larger system. So personally, I'm not that much directly involved in this kind of work as of yet, but I have been told by a number of colleagues that there is a very significant relationship, and I think it's a very interesting area to explore more to. And whoever, asked the question, I would be, maybe after the session, I would, if you're more connected to that or have practical experience, I would love to stay in exchange around that and to learn from whatever the experiences are.
But the one that I just saw come across the chat is about the issue or challenge of incumbent power and what you do with that, either from a positive perspective or, as more of an obstacle in affecting change.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So it's we all remember how Hitler came to power through elections, and not through actually direct vote, right? Kind of not through. It was through elections and coalition building. So we see democracy in danger today, and on the defense, because our country here is the best example. From within, not from outside, and that in a way. So the enemy is within. So the enemy is like. So we are armed to the teeth as a country, right? Against all these external threats and forces with a massive military. or where does the real threat come from? It's coming from within. I think that's like you remember kind of the presencing move kind of from bending. So what is it? I think leadership today, you can reframe. So in this century, the most scarce resource is attention, right? So what do we do as leaders? We are shaping fields of attention. So what you really do as a leader, kind of you shape the fields of collective attention one way or another. And when we do that as a leader, it's not only what we focus on, but it's also kind of bending the beam of collective attention back onto yourself, right? So it's kind of this, remember kind of the telescope moving out and then kind of the telescope bending and pointing back on the observer. That's the shift in consciousness. And what it means as a leader and in any kind of system today, or as a systems thinker, is creating infrastructures that help us to see ourselves in the mirror, right? And the mirror of reality. And seeing ourselves kind of in the mirror of reality is bending the beam of observation back onto ourselves. So that's I think kind of this incumbent power is really is calling for distributed leadership, for resilience, is calling from a bottom up. Yes, that's our story. That's the last 1,000 years of history in the West. What's the headline? Bottom up. That's who we are. And so in that way, kind of the Trump challenge is a wake-up call that we need to reconnect with this source. So it's not the end of this journey. It's just kind of a wake-up call to reconnect with that. And America today when you look at the public conversation and what's happening kind of maybe, or what happened until last week or something, top down is a little bit depressing and all these things, but it's also bringing a new movement from the bottom up that starts in cities, in companies, in towns, and on a state level. And it's kind of re-energizing kind of this, because that kind of problem will not be solved by any single person. It's something we need to do together, and it's something that in most cases starts locally and not on the national or global level. So it's a microcosm of where we are at, and it's a movement that's already in many places, but mostly local and mostly not aggregating to a national or international level. And that's why this infrastructure societal transformation lab, or that's also where I think kind of education, the educational sector and the university of the 21st century can hopefully play a helpful role. Somebody has to play that role. There's no other institution in society better positioned to do that. But of course, are we living up to that? Very little, right? Do we have the capability? Absolutely. But it will require a new form of alliances. And that's where we all need to just keep trying. And that's basically the intention of the Societal Transformation Lab.